مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. بعد أن أعتقد معظم الأمريكيين أن حملتنا الانتخابية لا يمكن أن تحمل أي مفاجآت أخرى، جاء شهر أكتوبر بالمفاجأة الكبرى إذا هاجم فيروس كورونا الرئيس ترامب والسيدة الأولى ميلانيا ترامب وعددا كبيرا من أعضاء مجلس الشيوخ والنشطاء السياسيين الجمهوريين في طول البلد وأرضها. تشارك الديمقراطيون والجمهوريون في تمني الشفاء السريع والتام للرئيس والسيدة الأولى. وفي الوقت نفسه شكلت الجوانب السياسية المتعلقة بصحة الرئيس ضربة لحملته التي أرادت أن تركز البلد على قضايا أخرى مثل تراجع معدل البطالة على الصعيد الوطني وانتقاد الرئيس للمرشح الديمقراطي جو بايدن. ولكن مع إصابة الرئيس نفسه بكوفيد فإن الموضوع الذي طغى على حياة 33 مليون أمريكي هذا العام بدأ أنه على الأرجح سيدخل على السياسة حتى يوم الانتخابات. أي أثر سيكون لصحة الرئيس على الانتخابات؟ هل يمكن أن يستغل تعافيه من المرض لمصلحته؟ لمناقشة أثر هذه المفاجآت التي حملها شهر أكتوبر على الحملة الانتخابية يسرني أن أرحب في برنامج داخل واشنطن بالمراقبين السياسيين البارزين تيم ألبرتا ومات بيربل. Ever since the election of 1980, Americans have wondered whether there will be an October surprise in the weeks before they go to vote for President of the United States. We recently talked on this show about what the October surprise would be this year, and no one guessed that it would be the president getting the coronavirus. So today we're going to talk about the implications of the president getting the illness, what it means for the election, and what might be left in store in the final days before our election date. Our guests today, Matt Purple and Tim Alberta. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. So, the president getting coronavirus. Tim, should this really have been a surprise?
No, I think the only surprise is that it didn't happen sooner, quite frankly, given the White House's rather lax rules and regulations surrounding mask wearing, surrounding social distancing. Folks around the president would be the first to tell you that they did not really take this very seriously. And that manifested itself in any number of different ways. And there's some small degree of irony here that the event that appears to have been the so-called super spreader, in which several prominent Washington Republicans were afflicted with COVID-19, was the Rose Garden ceremony announcing the nomination to the Supreme Court of Amy Coney Barrett. I say it's ironic because there are so many Republicans who, over the last 4 years, have essentially submitted to what they consider this Faustian bargain with the president, where they're willing to sort of bite their tongue and look the other way and support him in spite of their unease with him, primarily because they are so invested in the idea of a conservative Supreme Court and the president's ability to deliver Supreme Court justices. And this would be his third.
Thankfully, it appears as though the president has overcome the worst of the virus. What did we learn about how the White House functions in a moment like this? What do we now know more about how the Oval Office operated at a moment of presidential illness?
Well, we learned it was completely unprepared, I think. I mean, it was rather calamitous dysfunction from what we were reading, at least in some newspapers. It was turned into a bit of a crisis zone. You know, they were coming in, they were quarantining rooms. There were guys in biohazard suits who were spraying down various rooms in the White House. There wasn't really any clear protocol for what was supposed to happen if a good number of people in the administration got sick, as did happen from that Amy Coney Barrett ceremony that Tim mentioned. And yeah, you know, of course, we're very glad that the president appears to be doing better. But there were some tense moments last week. You know, he was on Twitter. He was what appeared to be rage tweeting for a little while. There were some questions about whether that was caused by a steroid that he had been prescribed as a result of the coronavirus. He abruptly pulled out of talks with the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, where they were trying to, and the Senate Majority Leader as well, where they were trying to negotiate another round of coronavirus stimulus, and then basically said later that evening that he wanted to get back into them, and now he's calling for an even bigger package. So there was a lot of dysfunction. And again, you know, Trump is not your guy if you want steady, consistent, slow, boring governance. I think we've seen that for a very long time. But this was a real surprise, a real upheaval, I think, even for him. And it was kind of ironic, too, because back last week, a couple weeks ago, American coronavirus cases, they were going up a little bit, but it was a fairly steady trickle. You know, it wasn't very much. They're going up by more now. But nonetheless, it ran rampant across the White House. You know, the White House became kind of a hotbed. A very interesting turn of events, for sure.
I'd like to ask both of you this. Of course, this is a health event, but it's also a political event, too. What's the politics of the president having and appearing now to overcome the coronavirus? Does it help him, showing that he's resilient, or does it hurt him, showing that he didn't take adequate precautions to prevent coming down with the illness in the first place? Matt, I'll start this time with you.
Yeah, well, it really is a testament to how divided the United States is that it's probably going to do both. There were there were kind of too good to check reports that the president wanted to come out of the hospital and flash the Superman sign from out of his shirt to the cameras. And I think that was probably, if true, it was a move to his base, a signal to his base, because his base is very much motivated by this idea of strength. You know, they like this energy in the executive. They like the idea that they have a strong protector and defender, somebody who's looking out for their interests and who can overcome just about anything in their name. And now he's beaten the coronavirus too. So that's going to play into a narrative that they have constructed for him. I think it's only going to help with them. Does that mean it's going to change very much? I don't think so. We are very hardened in our views right now on this side of the Atlantic. So I think it's just going to cement what people already think.
Tim, any impact of this illness one way or the other in your view, especially in battleground states?
You know, as much as we are all invested in how dramatic events late in a campaign can produce dramatic swings in public opinion and potentially, change the trajectory of a race, I think what we've seen in this presidential contest between Donald Trump and Joe Biden is that for all of the extraordinary and unprecedented volatility in this campaign, you're talking about a presidential campaign unfolding against the backdrop of a global health pandemic, of an economic meltdown, of social unrest sweeping the streets in big American cities and small American towns. And yet the trend lines of this race, the basic trajectory of this race has been remarkably steady throughout. And it does speak to, on the one hand, that level of polarization that Matt was alluding to. But I think it's also just a testament to the president's own inability to expand his base of support into a broader coalition of support. There's a phrase in American politics called low ceiling, high floor, which essentially means that the president has achieved a level of support from his core base of voters that cannot erode under almost any circumstance. And we have seen that over the last 4 years, that the president...
40%.
Yeah, well, yes, and among self-described conservative Republicans, it's 85 to 90%. These are people who are not going away, right? But the question has always been, can the president build from that 40 to 43% range? Can he build it up higher into the mid to high 40s? And he has consistently struggled to do that. And so, whether or not the American people view the president surviving COVID-19 and coming back feeling 20 years younger as he claims he does, whether they view that as some sort of a personal triumph or not, I'm not entirely sure. But I do know from every metric we have to gauge politically how they view him and how they view his handling of the pandemic, it doesn't really change anything.
So this stubborn lead that you described for Joe Biden, which has been remarkably consistent for months now, are there things in the president's power, in your view, that could be done to change this dynamic in the final days of the election? Matt?
Potentially. It would be extremely difficult, I think, but potentially he could. But again, you come back to this tendency to just unload the gun into his own foot, to just damage himself over and over again. And you just compound the damage with that pulling out of the stimulus talks, like I was talking about before, which looks very bad to working class Americans, to business owners, to people who are really suffering because of the economic lockdowns over here, who need some money. And the government can't seem to come together and do it. And right now, he looks like the reason why. He looks like the guy who pushed down on the dynamite plunger, so to speak. So again, it's difficult, and you would need a certain amount of shrewdness. I think you would need a certain amount of tact, and that just isn't Trump's way. Trump's way is to slam down very hard on one side of the culture war, on one side of cultural issues over here, and rally people behind him and charge his base. That worked in 2016. He was able to win over enough working class Rust Belt voters, Rust Belt by which we mean the former heart of industrial America, in order to pull it off and to get 46% of the vote allotted in the right states that he could win the Electoral College against an extraordinarily weak Democratic opponent. Is he going to be able to pull that off twice, especially with a pandemic and the resulting economic damage? It doesn't look likely at this point.
All right. Well, when we come back, I'm going to ask you, Tim, about at least one major political event that did occur while the president was ill, and that was the vice presidential debate that took on special importance precisely because of the president's illness with COVID. We're going to discuss that and the final days of this campaign in just a moment. A courageous Black woman of Caribbean origin, she broke through barriers when she was elected to Congress, and then again when she ran for president. She didn't win that race, but her name will forever be engraved in the annals of trailblazing politicians in American history. The pioneer was named Shirley Chisholm. Kamala Harris, the Democratic senator from California, is making history as the first Black woman on a major party ticket for president. But Chisholm was the first Black woman to run for president. Indeed, the first woman of any race ever to run for the Democratic nomination. The daughter of a baker's helper and a seamstress, Chisholm rose through the loyal Democratic Party ranks in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood of New York City to become the first Black woman ever elected to Congress, winning an open seat and a crushing landslide in 1968. 4 years later, she ran for president, and with little money and no establishment support, she won about 9% of the party's delegates and earned a respectable fourth place finish. The role of women, especially Black women, would never be the same. It took almost a half century, but Kamala Harris's place on the ballot owes itself to the tenacity and the vision of Shirley Chisholm. Our guests again today include Tim Alberta. Tim is chief political correspondent for Politico magazine. In that job, Tim covers the biggest stories in politics: the 2020 presidential campaign, congressional battles between and within the two parties, and the evolving role of money in American politics. He is the author of the best-selling book, American Carnage, on the front lines of the Republican Civil War and the rise of President Trump. Also joining us is Matt Purple. Matt is senior editor at The American Conservative, a magazine and website covering American politics and government policy. Previously, he was assistant managing editor at The American Spectator and deputy editor for Rare Politics. His work has appeared in such platforms as National Review, The National Interest, the UK Spectator, and the Washington Times. So, Tim, let's look at that one major political event that for a moment transfixed America because the president's health seemed uncertain, and that is the vice presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Mike Pence. What did we learn, if anything, from that face-off?
Well, we learned that at the very least, the American people could still tune in during prime time and watch something of a civilized, substantive debate between two adults who represent their respective parties and who were able to discuss things in a manner that was, I think, more familiar to most of the American public who remember a time before 2016 when politics was not just such a circus, quite frankly. That having been said, I don't think that the viewing public necessarily learned a whole lot because both candidates were ducking and dodging and evading almost every question that was asked of them, and neither one necessarily turned in the sort of virtuoso performance that could change this race, change perceptions of them, change perceptions of their party and of their tickets. So I hate to continually dump cold water over potential developments that might normally have the capacity for altering a race like this. But the vice presidential debate may have been the least consequential vice presidential debate that we've seen in this country, and certainly in decades, and maybe even in modern American history. There was just very little said or done to significantly reshape the contours of the race.
Matt, do you agree with that? The least consequential vice presidential debate in modern history?
Yeah, to a point. I would only hesitate to say I'm not sure how much these vice presidential debates ever matter. But in this case, I think that it was almost wholly irrelevant, like Tim said. And again, it mattered to the point that it was nice to get a breath of fresh air after the last debate. The last debate was so chaotic, was so turbulent, and this one was a relatively civilized affair. And I think people probably appreciated that. There was a hunger for that. The problem was that desperation really papered over the fact that this wasn't a great debate. I mean, Mike Pence came off as, I thought, very sleepy, not particularly engaging, occasionally a bit oily. I thought that Kamala Harris was patronizing and kind of faltered, especially towards the end. Both were extraordinarily evasive, as Tim was saying. Really not great all around. I say that I think that Pence probably won narrowly, and normally that might perhaps help the Trump campaign. But again, here, you live by Donald Trump, you die by Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is Donald Trump in, massive letters. I mean, Donald Trump is the Trump ticket.
Tim, have we begun to see ever so slightly some daylight appearing between some of these congressional or Senate candidates and President Trump?
To the extent we have, it's the sort of daylight that you have to squint to be able to see, and we should recognize that the distance that any of these down ballot Republicans might seek to establish between themselves and the president has to be done in a way that is very inconspicuous and almost unnoticeable to the average voter, because as much as they understand the importance of distinguishing themselves from the president and forging their own identity, their own unique brand in the eyes of voters, particularly moderates and independent voters and soft Democrats who are going to vote for Joe Biden at the top of the ticket, but who might at the same time be worried about the potential of a unified government completely controlled by Democrats moving forward, and they might want some balance in Washington.
Matt, let me ask you the question that we opened the show with. October surprise. We still have some days left in this month. Are we due for another electoral surprise? And what might it be?
I sometimes think we're due for another dozen or two, given the way that we've been going, hurricanes and wildfires and chaos.
Matt Purple, Tim Alberta, thank you for joining us and helping to explain the almost inexplicable, the final weeks before our election. Thank you. We elect presidents to do a job mere mortals cannot do. How can one person lead 330 million others? How can one person run the executive branch of government that has 2.1 million employees and is responsible for everything from fighting forest fires to sending astronauts to outer space? How can that same one person serve as commander-in-chief of the most powerful military the world has ever seen, with 1.3 million men and women in uniform, operating in land, sea, and air, and every continent of the world? How can one person serve as the unifying force of a nation, lead great crusades for peace and progress, marshal votes in the national legislature, speak to the youth of the country, and make decisions great and small that affect every person on earth? As Fitzgerald said of the rich, presidents are different than you and me. Fueled by ambition and destiny, they have to be different to get the job, to keep the job, and especially to do the job right. This is why it's always so jarring when something happens to a president's health. It reminds us of their mortality. It reminds us that they're just people, not superheroes or supervillains, depending on your politics. And that reminds us that the job may just be too big for any one person. Sometimes some evildoer launches a terrible plot against a president, as when John Kennedy was assassinated, or when Gerald Ford or Ronald Reagan came close to falling victims to assassination plots. Those are horrific moments when time stands still. But those moments tend to underscore the fact that presidents are different from ordinary citizens, most of whom are not the targets of elaborate conspiracies. Oddly, what can even be more unsettling is when a president just falls ill, seriously ill. It happens more often than you think. In the last 100 years, while in office, Woodrow Wilson had a deadly flu and suffered a stroke. Warren Harding died of a heart attack. Franklin Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Dwight Eisenhower had a stroke and a heart attack. Ronald Reagan had prostate and skin cancer. By contracting the coronavirus, Donald Trump joins that list. Presidents who got serious, life-threatening illnesses while in office. After getting aggressive therapies at an elite military hospital, the president thankfully appears to have overcome the virus, though only time will bear that out. What we know is that he joined millions of other Americans of every race, every religion, every national origin, in every corner of our country in contracting the illness. He may have displayed determination in overcoming the illness, but it was born of the same vulnerability we all share, the vulnerability we have as mere mortals facing an invisible killer. Bahada nasilul nehayat hadhi hilhalka min barnamij dakhil Washington. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول عملية الخلافة الرئاسية في أمريكا. أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي على تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.